The cold air clung to the cedar trees as deputies paused beside the abandoned turnout, their flashlights cutting across frost and gravel, revealing a purse half buried near the road, a single shoe nearby, and the unmistakable silence that told seasoned investigators this discovery would not end quickly. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In December of 1988, outside the small Texas town of Bellwood, a place defined by feed stores, church marquees, and two-lane highways, the discovery along County Road 14 set off a chain of events that would quietly haunt law enforcement for decades. The item found first was not a body but the evidence of absence. A young woman had vanished, leaving behind personal effects arranged by circumstance, not intention. Her name was Rachel Lynn Harper. She was 22 years old. She had come home for the holidays. Rachel Harper grew up in Bellwood, graduating from the local high school before leaving for community college in nearby Waco. She worked part-time at a department store and had returned home a week before Christmas to stay with her parents. Thanksgiving had passed quietly. Christmas decorations lined Main Street. The town paper had already printed a photograph of the courthouse lawn covered in lights. Rachel was last seen on the evening of December 21, 1988, driving her blue 1983 Chevrolet Cavalier toward a friend's house across town. She never arrived. When Rachel did not return home by midnight, concern set in. Her parents waited through the early hours, telling themselves the same reassurances common in small towns. By morning, the Cavalier was still missing. The Bellwood Police Department filed a missing person report just after 9 a.m. Officers noted her age, clothing description, and vehicle. There was no indication she planned to leave town. Her bank account showed no unusual activity. Her suitcase remained unpacked in her childhood bedroom. The discovery along County Road 14 occurred that afternoon. A county road crew had stopped to repair a damaged culvert. One worker noticed a handbag in the brush. Inside were Rachel's driver's license, lipstick, and a folded receipt dated 2 days earlier. Deputies secured the area. Photographs were taken. The temperature hovered near freezing, unusual for Central Texas, preserving the scene in a way investigators would later note as significant. Search teams expanded outward from the turnout. Bloodhounds traced a scent for several hundred yards before losing it near a shallow creek. Tire impressions were photographed, though the ground was too hard to capture full tread patterns. By nightfall, the Texas Rangers had been notified, a standard escalation when a missing adult case showed signs of possible foul play. Local radio stations interrupted holiday music with bulletins asking for information. Rachel's vehicle was found 2 days later, abandoned behind a closed feed warehouse near the edge of town. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside, officers noted no obvious signs of a struggle. The back seat carpet showed faint discoloration, later tested and found to be consistent with diluted blood. At the time, the technology could not provide more detail. Samples were collected and sealed in evidence bags, logged carefully, and placed in the department's cold storage room, a converted closet with metal shelving and a single flickering bulb. On December 26, 5 days after Rachel disappeared, a hunter found her body in a wooded area off the Brazos River, approximately 7 miles from where her purse had been located. The site was remote but accessible by truck. The scene suggested she had been placed there deliberately. There was no overt trauma visible from a distance. Investigators worked quietly, aware that families in Bellwood were attending Christmas services that morning. The autopsy conducted at the county medical examiner's office revealed limited but critical information. Rachel had died from asphyxiation. There were no defensive wounds. The medical examiner estimated the time of death as within 12 hours of her disappearance. Trace fibers were collected from her clothing. Soil samples were taken from her shoes. Fingernail scrapings were preserved. The report noted the absence of certain indicators, suggesting she had known her attacker or had been taken by surprise. The investigation unfolded methodically. Detectives reconstructed Rachel's final day, reviewing store receipts, interviewing coworkers, and confirming sightings. She had stopped for gas at a station on Highway 6. The attendant recalled nothing unusual. A classmate reported seeing her car at a stoplight around 7:40 p.m. No one reported hearing screams or seeing a struggle. The case began to settle into the uneasy category of unsolved. By early January, tips slowed. Media attention faded as the new year began. Bellwood returned to routine, though Rachel's missing person flyers remained taped to utility poles, curling at the edges. The police department reviewed known offenders, including a recently paroled man living 2 counties away, but no evidence connected him to the case. Without witnesses or forensic certainty, leads collapsed under scrutiny. Over the years, the Harper case was revisited periodically. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes were moved during renovations. The purse, fibers, and blood samples remained sealed, untouched by advancements that had not yet arrived. Rachel's parents aged quietly, attending court sessions for unrelated cases, hopping one day to hear her name called again. In 2016, nearly 28 years after Rachel's death, Bellwood police partnered with a regional cold case task force. Advances in DNA analysis prompted a review of old evidence. The blood sample from the Cavalier was submitted for testing. Touched DNA was extracted from the purse strap. The results did not match any profile in the system. The case remained open, waiting. The renewed effort brought quiet changes to Bellwood. Files once dormant were scanned, indexed, and cross-referenced. Old interview tapes were digitized. Officers who had worked the case in 1988 were contacted for recollections, not for speculation but for procedural memory. One detail resurfaced repeatedly. A tan pickup truck had been reported near the gas station the evening Rachel disappeared. At the time, the tip was logged and cleared when no plate number surfaced. Decades later, it gained new relevance. The task force approached the case with modern discipline. Rachel's clothing fibers were re-examined using updated microscopy. Several fibers were consistent with automotive upholstery used in late 1970s and early 1980s Ford pickups. This did not identify a suspect, but it narrowed the field. Soil samples from her shoes were compared with samples from known locations along the Brazos River access roads. One area showed a close mineral match, suggesting she had been alive when transported there. Attention turned to movement patterns. Investigators reviewed traffic flow maps from 1988, noting which roads would have been quiet on a Wednesday night before Christmas. County Road 14 fit the pattern. So did the access lane behind the feed warehouse. The route formed a logical chain, efficient and discreet. It suggested familiarity with the town rather than a transient presence. In 2018, genealogical DNA databases became a lawful investigative option. With court approval, the task force uploaded an anonymized profile derived from the blood sample in Rachel's car. The process was slow and uncertain. Months passed without a match. Then a partial familial connection appeared, distant but measurable, linked to a family line rooted in Central Texas. The connection pointed not to Bellwood but to a neighboring county. Researchers built family trees using public records, census data, and obituaries. One branch included a man named Thomas Eugene Keller, born in 1959, who would have been 29 in 1988. Keller had worked intermittently as a delivery driver and mechanic. Records showed he owned a tan Ford F-150 during the late 1980s. He had no felony convictions, only minor traffic offenses. In 1988, he lived 30 miles from Bellwood but had relatives within town limits. Investigators moved carefully. They did not contact Keller immediately. Instead, they reviewed employment records and confirmed he had been laid off in December 1988. His former employer recalled nothing unusual but confirmed Keller had access to various vehicles. Property records showed he later moved out of state, settling quietly in New Mexico. Surveillance confirmed he was alive, retired, and living alone. A search warrant was obtained for Keller's discarded personal items, collected through lawful means. A coffee cup from a public trash receptacle provided a fresh DNA sample. Laboratory comparison produced a strong match to the profile from Rachel's car. The probability ratio was decisive. The finding was reviewed independently by 2 labs to ensure accuracy. The match held. With confirmation in hand, investigators re-examined Keller's history. In 1988, he had been dating a woman who lived near the gas station Rachel visited. The relationship ended abruptly weeks after Rachel's death. The former partner, now elderly, was interviewed. She recalled Keller returning home late one night before Christmas, agitated, with scratches on his hands. At the time, she accepted his explanation of mechanical work. She had not come forward, unaware of its significance. Investigators also reviewed old phone records, limited as they were. One call placed from a pay phone near the feed warehouse had been logged to Keller's residence on the night of December 21. The record existed, but had not been connected to him during the original investigation. The detail had been buried among hundreds of similar entries. In October 2020, a grand jury convened. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, the fiber analysis, the timeline reconstruction, and the corroborating witness statements. The case was built without reliance on confession or speculation. It rested on procedure, probability, and patience. An indictment was returned for murder. Keller was arrested quietly at his New Mexico home. There was no public spectacle. He was extradited to Texas, where he appeared in court in Bellwood, a town many residents barely remembered him from. The local paper reported the arrest with restrained language, noting the age of the case and the persistence of investigators. During pretrial proceedings, Keller did not contest the DNA findings. His defense focused on the passage of time. The court ruled the evidence admissible, citing proper chain of custody. The blood sample from the Cavalier had been stored correctly. The genealogical process had followed legal standards. In 2022, Keller entered a guilty plea to avoid trial. He admitted to encountering Rachel at the gas station, offering assistance, and later restraining her. The statement aligned with forensic findings and corrected minor gaps in the timeline. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. For Bellwood, the resolution arrived quietly. There were no crowds at the courthouse. Rachel Harper's name appeared once more in print, followed by words long awaited. Her parents, now in their 80s, attended the sentencing, sitting together, holding hands. Afterward, they returned home, passing the same streets decorated decades earlier for Christmas. The cold case was closed. Evidence boxes were marked accordingly. The purse, the fibers, the samples that had waded through seasons and years were returned to storage, now labeled resolved. In the weeks that followed, Bellwood entered another holiday season. Lights were hung. Church bells rang. And in the quiet spaces between routine and memory, the town acknowledged that persistence had finally brought Rachel Harper home. The months following the plea brought a period of administrative closure that revealed as much about the system as the crime itself. Investigators documented every procedural step, knowing the case would be reviewed by training units and legal scholars studying delayed justice. The Bellwood Police Department prepared a final report exceeding 800 pages, cataloging evidence movement, laboratory methods, and decision timelines. Each section reflected restraint, avoiding commentary and focusing on verifiable action. The report emphasized that no single breakthrough solved the case, only accumulation and preservation. Rachel Harper's remains had been interred in the local cemetery in early 1989, beneath a modest headstone placed during a winter burial. After the conviction, the family requested a quiet rededication. There was no ceremony announced in advance. A small marker was added, noting her name, age, and the year justice was concluded. The cemetery caretaker recalled the day as cold and still, similar to the morning Rachel was first reported missing. The symmetry was not lost on those present. Media attention remained subdued. National outlets declined to cover the story extensively, citing its age and lack of contemporary relevance. Local press handled it differently. Articles focused on process, not emotion. The Bellwood Gazette published excerpts from the final investigative summary, highlighting the importance of evidence retention. Letters to the editor reflected a generation that remembered the winter of 1988 clearly, recalling where they were when flyers appeared in store windows, and how the town grew quieter afterward. The courthouse records showed routine entries after sentencing. Appeals were waived. Transfer documents were signed. Keller was moved to a state facility several hours away, his name entering the system like any other inmate. Correctional intake notes described him as compliant and reserved. There were no further statements. His presence became administrative, reduced to identification numbers and scheduled reviews. For the task force, the case closure triggered a review of other dormant files. Rachel's investigation became a reference point, cited internally when discussing whether to reopen cases with preserved biological evidence. It demonstrated that even incomplete samples from the late 1980s could yield results if handled correctly. Training seminars used anonymized versions of the timeline to illustrate how minor tips, once dismissed, could gain relevance decades later. The evidence room in Bellwood was reorganized the following year. Shelving was replaced. Climate controls were installed. Each box received a barcode linked to a digital log. Rachel Harper's file was assigned a final status, but it was not removed. It remained as a completed record, accessible for review. The department resisted any symbolic disposal, preferring continuity over closure gestures. The impact on the Harper family unfolded privately. Rachel's parents declined interviews. Friends from her youth, now retired or nearing it, reconnected briefly, exchanging memories anchored to high school hallways and holiday gatherings long past. There were no public vigils. The family's response reflected the era in which Rachel was raised, valuing restraint and privacy over public expression. As winter approached again, Bellwood prepared for another season. The courthouse lights were tested in early December. The hardware store stacked artificial wreaths near the entrance. Traffic patterns shifted slightly as older residents avoided nighttime driving. These details mirrored those noted in the original case file, small environmental factors that shaped daily life and investigative opportunity. Law enforcement agencies across Texas requested copies of the forensic methodology used. The genealogical process underwent legal scrutiny, reaffirmed as compliant with state and federal guidelines. Judges cited the Harper case when ruling on evidence admissibility, noting the careful separation between public databases and law enforcement actions. The case entered legal literature as an example of measured application rather than aggressive expansion. In Bellwood, The feed warehouse behind which Rachel's car had been found was demolished. The property changed hands, slated for redevelopment. Before demolition, investigators conducted a final walkthrough, documenting the site one last time for archival completeness. Photographs were added to the case file, closing the physical loop between discovery and resolution. County Road 14 remained unchanged. The turnout where Rachel's purse was found showed no marker. Grass grew back unevenly. Drivers passed without noticing. For those who remembered, the location remained fixed in memory, a reminder of how ordinary places could become part of lasting records. The Harper case reinforced a principle often repeated quietly among investigators. Time alters context but not facts. Evidence, if preserved, retains its potential. The slow pace of the case, spanning more than 3 decades, reflected both limitations and discipline. It showed that resolution did not require spectacle, only persistence and adherence to procedure. In the final audit, the task force noted that no anonymous tip had solved the case. No sudden confession emerged. The outcome depended on incremental review and lawful innovation. This conclusion was shared with training academies, emphasizing patience over pressure. As the year closed, Bellwood marked another New Year's Day. Church bells rang at noon. Families gathered. The Harper name was no longer attached to uncertainty. Rachel Harper remained 22 in memory, but the question of what happened to her had been answered. The town carried on, not changed dramatically, but steadied by the knowledge that even after decades, the record could be completed. The closing years of the investigation produced reflections that extended beyond Bellwood, settling into broader discussions about age, memory, and accountability. Many of the men who followed the case closely were now in their 60s or older, retired from trades, service, or military work, accustomed to reading the newspaper slowly each morning. For them, the Harper case echoed a familiar truth that time does not erase responsibility, only delays its reckoning. The story carried weight precisely because it avoided drama and relied on discipline. Within the Bellwood Police Department, younger officers studied the case file not as history but as instruction. The documentation showed how early missteps were avoided, how assumptions were resisted, and how restraint preserved integrity. In 1988, investigators had resisted the temptation to label Rachel Harper a runaway. That decision, quiet at the time, preserved urgency and ensured evidence was gathered immediately. The value of that choice became apparent decades later, when preserved samples yielded answers. The weather records from December 1988 were revisited for completeness. Nighttime temperatures dipped lower than average, slowing decomposition and stabilizing trace evidence. Rainfall had been minimal, preventing contamination of the roadside turnout. These environmental details, logged originally as routine observations, became relevant again during later forensic review. The case demonstrated how thoroughness at the beginning, even when resolution seemed unlikely, could shape outcomes far in the future. Court transcripts from the sentencing were archived alongside the investigative file. They reflected procedural calm. There were no raised voices, no displays meant for cameras. The judge summarized the evidence plainly, referencing chain of custody, expert testimony, and statutory authority. The sentence was delivered without flourish. For observers accustomed to modern courtroom spectacle, the restraint felt deliberate, almost from another era. In the months after sentencing, Bellwood residents occasionally encountered visiting researchers or journalists tracing cold case outcomes. Most visits were brief. The town offered little in the way of visual narrative. No memorial stood roadside. No tour marked significant locations. The story existed primarily in records, not landmarks. This absence reinforced the sense that justice, once completed, did not require permanent display. Rachel Harper's childhood home remained occupied by family. Seasonal decorations still appeared each December, though simplified over time. Neighbors recalled earlier years when the house had gone dark after her disappearance, curtains drawn through multiple holiday seasons. After the case closed, lights returned modestly, signaling a private shift rather than public celebration. The Texas Department of Public Safety incorporated elements of the case into internal guidance on cold case prioritization. Emphasis was placed on preserved biological evidence, witness survivability, and jurisdictional cooperation. Rachel's case scored high on all three factors, explaining why it eventually moved forward while others remained dormant. This analytical framework influenced resource allocation statewide. Thomas Keller's incarceration followed predictable patterns. Intake evaluations noted age-related health concerns. He was placed in a lower security unit due to nonviolent conduct history within the facility. His name appeared occasionally in parole eligibility projections, though the timeline extended decades forward. There were no recorded attempts to contact the Harper family. The system treated his presence as resolved. The genealogical aspect of the investigation continued to draw scrutiny. Legal reviews reaffirmed that consent protocols had been followed and that no unauthorized data access occurred. This reassurance mattered, particularly to older audiences wary of technological overreach. The Harper case became an example cited when explaining that modern tools could be applied without eroding civil protections. As Thanksgiving approached the year after sentencing, local newspapers published reflective pieces on unresolved cases still waiting. Rachel Harper's name appeared only as a reference, an example of completion rather than loss. The contrast underscored how many families remained without answers. It also reinforced that resolution, when it came, often arrived quietly. Bellwood's courthouse basement housed the physical archives. Rows of metal cabinets contained files dating back generations. Rachel's case file occupied several drawers, thick with reports, photographs, and correspondence. Archivists ensured the materials were preserved under proper conditions, acknowledging their value beyond a single outcome. The file was flagged for historical significance, accessible to credentialed researchers. County Road 14 was resurfaced in a routine infrastructure project. Crews worked efficiently, unaware of the road's place in investigative history. No notation was made. For residents who remembered, the changes marked the passage of time more clearly than any calendar. Roads improved, buildings changed, records endured. The Harper case also influenced how missing adult reports were handled locally. Procedures were updated to emphasize immediate response regardless of age or presumed autonomy. Officers cited Rachel's disappearance as a reminder that early hours mattered, even when circumstances seemed ordinary. This shift reflected lessons learned rather than mistakes corrected. As winter settled again, Bellwood experienced a familiar rhythm: morning frost on windshields, shortened daylight, quiet evenings punctuated by church activities and school events. The Harper case no longer dominated conversation, but its resolution lingered as assurance rather than memory. It affirmed that unanswered questions could still be addressed within a lawful framework. For those who had followed the story since 1988, particularly older men who remembered reading about it while raising families or building careers, the conclusion resonated deeply. It reflected endurance, both personal and institutional. The case did not promise redemption or closure in emotional terms. It offered something steadier: a completed record, a name attached to responsibility, and a system that, though slow, had not forgotten. Rachel Harper's life remained defined by what was lost, but her case was no longer defined by absence. The investigation, stretched across seasons and decades, reached its lawful end without rewriting the past. It simply documented it fully. In doing so, it allowed Bellwood, and those who remembered that winter long ago, to carry forward without unanswered questions weighing quietly behind every holiday light and passing year. In the years following the legal conclusion, the Harper case settled into a different category of public memory, one defined not by mystery but by record. It became a reference point for how long investigations could persist without losing direction. Older residents spoke of it less often, yet when they did, it carried a tone of completion rather than regret. The story no longer ended with unanswered questions, but with documented accountability, something many believed was rare in cases stretching across generations and changing methods. Law enforcement agencies continued to study the investigation for its procedural consistency. Analysts noted that early documentation, though limited by the technology of the late 1980s, had been thorough enough to support later breakthroughs. Every evidence transfer had been logged, every sample preserved. There were no gaps large enough to undermine the final outcome. This consistency reassured communities that diligence, even when it seems unproductive at the time, retains long-term value. Rachel Harper's name gradually shifted in local conversation from a symbol of loss to a symbol of resolution. Her photograph no longer appeared on flyers but occasionally in retrospective articles discussing solved cold cases. The tone of these pieces remained factual, avoiding emotional excess. They focused instead on timelines, evidence handling, and lawful persistence. This approach reflected the values of the generation most affected by the case, one that preferred clarity over spectacle. The Harper family maintained their privacy. They did not seek public recognition or restitution beyond what the court provided. Friends noted subtle changes, a lightness during holiday gatherings that had been absent for decades. Thanksgiving dinners resumed a sense of routine. Christmas decorations, once minimal, appeared again with quiet consistency. These details, though small, marked a personal closure that required no announcement. Within the correctional system, Thomas Keller's case followed established protocols. Annual reviews acknowledged his sentence and age. There were no unusual incidents attached to his incarceration. His role in the public record narrowed to a line item, reinforcing the principle that justice, once applied, moves forward without ceremony. The system recorded, contained, and proceeded. The broader impact of the case influenced how communities perceived unresolved investigations. It reinforced the understanding that absence of resolution does not imply abandonment. Files can remain active in principle even when dormant in practice. The Harper case demonstrated that time alone does not determine relevance. Evidence preserved with care can speak when methods evolve. As Bellwood continued to change, new residents arrived with little knowledge of the events of 1988. Older residents occasionally explained the story, not with urgency but with context. They described how the town once waded through a winter of uncertainty, and how, decades later, answers arrived without warning. These explanations served less as cautionary tales and more as affirmations of institutional memory. The courthouse archives preserved the Harper file alongside others spanning decades. Archivists treated it as a completed chapter, not a relic. Researchers accessing the file encountered a narrative defined by restraint. There were no speculative notes, no sensational language. The documentation reflected a commitment to accuracy that stood apart from trends toward dramatization. Seasonal rhythms continued to shape the town's atmosphere. Winter brought familiar patterns of cold mornings and early evenings. Summer returned with heat and routine. Through it all, The Harper case remained fixed in the past, no longer intruding on the present. Its resolution allowed the town to remember without reliving. For those who had followed the case since the beginning, particularly older men who had seen many changes over their lifetimes, the conclusion carried particular weight. It aligned with values of patience, accountability, and respect for process. The case did not promise emotional healing, but it delivered factual completeness. That distinction mattered deeply to those who measured justice by records rather than reactions. Rachel Harper's life was brief, and her death altered the course of many lives around her. Yet the final record restored something essential. It replaced uncertainty with documented truth. It affirmed that even when decades pass, responsibility can still be assigned lawfully and clearly. The Harper case did not end with celebration or spectacle. It ended with a closed file, a completed sentence, and a town that could finally place the past where it belonged, in the record rather than the unanswered present.